trade war between the US and China seemed like a battle between giants, but now China has turned the tables and taken the lead. How could a nation under attack manage to reverse the situation, forcing the challenger to come to the negotiation table? This shift not only surprised the US, but it also marks the beginning of a new chapter in China's approach to dealing with global powers. The tide has turned, and now China is in control of the game. The story begins at a time when the whole world held its breath, watching the moves of two global giants. At that moment, President Donald Trump unexpectedly struck a hard blow, imposing tariffs on a wide range of Chinese goods. This move felt like a declaration of war. The US was kicking off a trade war like no one had ever seen before. Everyone thought China would falter, but no, just 48 hours later, Beijing showed it wasn't backing down, immediately retaliating with its own tariffs. No hesitation, no concession. Clearly, China had prepared for this scenario and was ready for anything. President Trump continued to threaten. If China didn't back down, the US would increase the tariffs even further. But instead of retreating, China stood firm, and in fact, began to show an even more resolute stance. And then, the unexpected happened. The US started to back down. Washington proactively reached out to Beijing, suggesting a return to negotiations. Gone were the bold proclamations of imposing tariffs to teach China a lesson. Now, there was patience. The dynamics had shifted. China was no longer on the defensive. It was now in control of the game, and it became clear, in this game, the one with more grit would be the one to take the upper hand. The trade war continued to escalate, but surprisingly, China managed to flip the situation dramatically. After a prolonged standoff, the US suddenly changed its approach and took the initiative to seek peace. Indeed, it was Washington that was the first to make an effort to de-escalate the situation. On April 6th, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce sent a clear message. China confirmed that the US had reached out multiple times through various channels, expressing a desire to resume talks. However, things weren't as simple as they seemed. China wasn't in a rush to respond immediately. Instead, it set one clear condition. Any negotiations must be based on good faith and mutual respect. This meant that China didn't want to be seen as the weaker party, and certainly didn't want the US to think that imposing tariffs would easily force Beijing into concessions. In fact, China directly pointed out that it was the unilateral tariffs imposed by the US that had eroded trust between the two nations. China made a straightforward demand. If the US wanted to engage in serious negotiations, it would need to remove all existing tariffs. Without this, any efforts to rebuild trust would be futile. And of course, the US would lose more credibility if it didn't take concrete actions. Recalling the peak tensions in the trade war, the US imposed tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods, and China responded with tariffs of 125% on American products. However, in an effort to minimize direct damage, both sides excluded certain essential goods from their tariff lists to avoid severe losses to their respective economy. In the end, despite the US pushing hard, it was unable to gain the upper hand. China turned the tide, becoming the one in control and forcing the US to find a way out of this trade crisis on its own. The standoff between the US and China entered a tense phase. Although both sides spoke of the possibility of negotiations, neither wanted to be the first to back down. In order to save face and avoid appearing weak, both China and the US made very strong statements, turning every move into a probing gesture. Both sides were playing the waiting game, hoping the other would give in first. Expert Tian Chensu noted that, at this stage, the two powers were testing each other's resolve. There might even have been some unofficial, low-level meetings where both sides were likely looking for signals from each other without making any public commitments. However, no one could deny that if formal negotiations did take place, the two sides might agree to reduce the tariffs to around 40–50% within 1 to 2 quarters. Such a scenario would help ease tensions and, to some extent, stabilize the economies of both countries. Even US Treasury Secretary Scott Benn opened the door for the possibility of de-escalating tensions in the near future. Yet, while things remained uncertain, both China and the US held firm in their positions. Everyone knew that this conflict was far from over, and the cost of making any concessions could be extremely high. Despite the US showing signs of reducing tariffs, China maintained its firm stance and showed no intention of making easy concessions. Experts like Danu from OC Group have observed that while the US might take actions to ease tensions, China has not altered its political position. Beijing was clear there would be no serious negotiations unless the US removes all the existing tariffs. The Chinese government reiterated that any talks could only occur in an environment of fairness and mutual respect, and they would not concede to the imposed actions of the US. This was strongly reflected in the statements of Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Mr. Lin Jian, who criticized the unilateral tariffs imposed by the US. He argued that such actions violated the legal rights of other nations, breached WTO regulations, weakened the multilateral trading system, and disrupted the global economic order. China's stance was clear and unyielding. They firmly opposed unilateralism and the protectionist, economic bullying tactics pursued by the US. Not only was China defending its own interests, but it also warned that the US tariff measures were not only harmful to China, but would also have negative effects on the US economy and the international community. Therefore, China argued that if the US continued with this policy, both China and the global economy would face severe consequences. Meanwhile, China continued to make it clear that it would not be coerced into unilateral negotiations and would make no concessions unless the US took real, constructive actions to improve trade relations. China's position remained firm. If the US wanted to negotiate, it had to genuinely show good faith and stop its coercive, unilateral actions. China is prepared to confront the United States if Washington continues to adopt a confrontational stance. However, China is not acting rashly or emotionally. In a strong statement, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce affirmed that if the US chooses to escalate the conflict, Beijing is ready to fight to the end. But every decision will be made cautiously, with strategic calculation, not impulsively. China's state-run media, especially major outlets like Global Times and People's Daily, have published articles asserting that the country is thoroughly prepared, both economically and strategically, for a second trade war. Additionally, Bloomberg has noted that since the first confrontation under President Trump, China has made significant strides. China has become far more technologically self-reliant, no longer heavily dependent on Western technology. The country has also implemented bold reforms to its domestic market and expanded and developed its financial system to minimize exposure to external economic fluctuation. All these developments show that China has not only responded to the trade war, but has turned it into an opportunity to strengthen its economic foundation, preparing itself to face future challenges with greater resilience. The US imposed tariffs not only on China, but also on 180 other trade partners, a move many considered unilateral and isolating for the US. However, China did not see this as a devastating blow. Instead, it turned the crisis into an opportunity. Seizing the moment, China increased its investments in core technologies, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and renewable energy. This helped China reduce its reliance on technology from outside, particularly from the US, which was crucial for building a self-reliant foundation. Not stopping there, China proactively expanded its domestic market, creating a larger space for domestic products to thrive. It began restructuring its supply chains, not only to mitigate the damage from the trade war, but also to increase the competitiveness of its economy. Moreover, China shifted its trade focus to regions like Europe and developing countries. These markets were less affected by US tariff policies and had high growth potential. While the US struggled with internal divisions and couldn't find a unified direction in its trade policy, China quietly carried out major reforms and transformed the crisis into a long-term strategic advantage. China wasn't just coping with the trade war, it was moving ahead in the global trade game, creating beneficial changes for itself in the long run. In the trade war with the United States, China adopted a highly strategic approach that aligned with the philosophy of Sun Tzu, using stillness to control motion. Instead of reacting aggressively and immediately, China chose a selective retaliation strategy, avoiding excessive escalation. Their clear objective was to apply just enough pressure to make the US feel the consequences of its tariffs, while not giving Washington further justification to intensify the conflict. This strategy not only kept China from being cornered, but also allowed it to maintain domestic stability and political resilience. While the US faced pressure from domestic businesses and politicians, China remained internally solid, shielding its policymaking from external influences. More importantly, this approach gave China the time it needed to build resilience and redirect its strategy, reconstructing a stronger economic and political foundation for the future. China was not in a hurry. Instead, it moved patiently, adjusting step by step and creating a position of strategic initiative, waiting for the right moment to strengthen its advantages in the ongoing trade war. While the US continued to provoke tensions with its trading partners, China seized the opportunity to strengthen relationships with countries under American pressure, such as the EU, Japan, Canada, and Mexico. Not only did China maintain its existing partnerships, but it also proactively proposed alternative cooperation mechanisms, aiming to establish a more robust global network of relations. One of China's most notable initiatives was the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which expanded its influence across developing nations. Additionally, China promoted multilateral trade agreements like RCEP and CPTPP to replace the bilateral arrangements disrupted by US tariffs. China also opened its investment markets further, creating favorable conditions for other countries to engage in its trade system. Through these efforts, China has successfully projected an image of moderation and responsibility as a nation adversely affected by the trade war, while the US came to be seen as aggressive and self-serving. China's deft diplomatic maneuvering not only helped it retain global stature, but also forced the US to soften its stance, facing a shifting international landscape that is increasingly multipolar. Ultimately, China has demonstrated its ability to maintain stability and respond with strategic foresight under global pressure. Although the US was the first to initiate the tariff war, it is now Washington that finds itself chasing after negotiations with China. While the future of the trade conflict remains uncertain, it is evident that China has gained a significant upper hand in terms of positioning, conduct, and international perception. The balance has shifted. China has not only used the crisis to strengthen its internal resilience, but also asserted its proactive role on the global stage. The trade war is not yet over, but it is clear that the game now has a dominant player, and that player is China.